This is the World Unpacked. I'm your host, Doug Farrer. Welcome back. We've all been watching the war in Ukraine and wondering, why is the Russian military failing so badly to achieve its objectives? I read an interesting piece by Elliot Ackerman just the other day in The Atlantic. Elliot traveled to Ukraine and met with a former Marine who was serving alongside the Ukrainians fighting the Russians on the front lines. That Marine observed that the javelins and the NLAWs, the high-tech anti-tank weapons that the Ukrainian military is using so effectively, have been destroying heavily armored Russian tanks left and right. The Marine said that when he was in Fallujah serving the U.S. military, being inside of a tank was the safest place you can be, and the RPGs being used by the enemy there would just bounce right off. But in Ukraine, the tank became a target, a dangerous place to be. And he went further to say that he wondered whether tank warfare would change forever as a result of this fight. That got me thinking, is the future of war different than what we thought before the Russian invasion? And what does that mean for the U.S. assumptions about militaries who we might have a war with? To help me unpack all of this, I brought on retired Lieutenant General of the U.S. Army Charles Hooper, or Hoop. Hoop's had an extraordinary 41-year military career and is now a senior counselor at the Cohen Group and a colleague of mine at the Carnegie Endowment. Hoop managed arms sales to friendly militaries and is focused specifically on the U.S.-China security competition. Here we go. Hoop, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
So before we get into the topic, you've led an incredible career of service in the military. Tell us a little bit about yourself, why you joined the military, a little bit about your background.
Well, thanks for asking, by the way. I come from a family of public servants. My father, most of my uncles were, in fact, all of my uncles were veterans. And then after they served their military time, they became policemen, firemen. My father was a New York City policeman. My mother was a teacher, and most of my aunts were teachers. So I come from a family of public servants, and so it was quite natural that I would look for a career in some type of public service. As I said, I grew up around a bunch of veterans, so I kind of naturally gravitated towards a career in the military, wanted to go to a good school. And, there are a few better schools in the country than our service academies. And so I applied to West Point, was accepted, and then went into West Point and graduated from there and started my Army career. Now, I got to tell you, no kid graduates at 22 from college and says, hey, this is a lot of fun. I think I'll do this for the next 41 years, right? So, but it turned out I enjoyed it, and the Army gave me some great opportunities, and then culminated my career at the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, where I was responsible for all foreign military sales to our allies and partners, as well as the provisioning of other capabilities, instruction, education, and these types of things. And so that's kind of what drew me to it. It was 41 years on active duty. It went by in the blink of an eye. I loved every minute of it, and felt like I was making a contribution.
Most analysts, including analysts at the Pentagon, expected a swift Russian victory over the Ukrainian forces. That obviously didn't happen. So what did we all miss?
My dad used to say you can kind of BS the world, just don't believe your own BS. And so they found themselves propagandizing about the capabilities of the Ukrainian leadership, that they were corrupt and they were incompetent, and propagandizing about the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces, about the fact that the people would welcome them, and they were pursuing this anti-fascist campaign. None of this was true. But it appears as if they believed their own propaganda, and that shaped the way they initially went into this conflict. So that's point number one. The number two is no wars ever evolve the way you think they will. They tend towards entropy. They tend towards increased violence. And in fact, I'm rereading John Toland's great book on the rise and fall of the Japanese Empire, The Rising Sun, and it talks a little bit about what led Japan to feel as if they could win a war against the United States before World War II. And so you get this miscalculation on their part of that the fact that they could control this conflict in ways that were supportive of their interest. And so the Russians believed that they could, and clearly that was wrong. And to a certain extent, we believed that they could. But the enemy gets a vote here. And in this case, the Ukrainians chose to fight. They chose to fight vigorously, and I don't think the Russians were expecting that. And I'm not sure the West was really expecting the extent to which the Ukrainians would resist, and that they would exhibit a national will that has allowed them to essentially defeat the Russian first effort. The third is, um, when I was a young lieutenant colonel, I was in the war plans division on the Army staff, and that they used to call that the Eisenhower division. And then Colonel Eisenhower, later of course General and President Eisenhower, had a saying that we all internalized, and that was that plans themselves, that is, war plans themselves, the paper upon which a plan is written, plans are useless. But the art and the process of planning, of anticipating outcomes, and planning for various branches and sequels to what you anticipate might happen, planning itself is everything. Putin went into this with one plan for a short war, clearly, and he had no plan B. And we're only now seeing the formulation of a plan B after the catastrophic failure and subsequent doubling down on plan A, which was never going to work. So he only had one plan. He stuck to that plan. The plan didn't work. And we saw a Russian failure. The fourth point is, and I can tell you this as someone who was responsible for arms sales, military technologies does not equate to capability. And even quantity, we often say quantity has a quality of its own. Even that does not necessarily equate to a military capability and does not guarantee you success in an armed conflict. People make a difference. So, in this initial effort, the Russians had these conscripts. They lied to these conscripts about where they were going and what they were going to be doing. As a result, the conscripts didn't believe or didn't have any trust in their leadership. The leadership certainly didn't have any trust in their soldiers. And because of the fact that there was no will to fight here, no elan, no esprit de corps, no, no collective will on the part of the Russian troops themselves to fight this conflict, it didn't matter that they had advanced technology or even a quantitative edge because the will to fight wasn't there. They weren't properly trained, they weren't properly led, and the end result was their initial failure in this conflict.
I mean, a lot of this is wrapped up in the propaganda and the things you just mentioned that the Russians sort of believe their own BS. Also, the Ukrainians very spirited. If you're an analyst in the Pentagon or a general and you're looking at the capabilities of various different militaries, how do you figure out how that aspect, that sort of intangible aspect, plays into military preparedness? Because otherwise, it's sort of just numbers of tanks, size of battalions, and so forth, right?
Any good leader can tell you whether or not there's a unit cohesion there, whether there's been a lot of discussion and several articles on, we're sending them all this equipment. Are they going to be able to absorb it effectively and efficiently? Can they learn fast enough? And I think the other day, either the Minister of Defense or President Zelensky himself had to get on and say, don't worry about it. We'll learn quickly how to use it. But any good leader has a sense for these types of things, whether or not the force has esprit de corps, elan, whether it's unified, whether the leaders trust their soldiers, and equally important, whether the soldiers trust their leaders. So, I mean, there's no empirical objective metric for this. But I can tell you that any good leader on our side in the Pentagon, our generals, and those people that we have on the ground that are observing this, they're reporting back and saying, hey, these guys they're together, they're unified, they have the spirit to resist. And all we need to give them is, to paraphrase Churchill, is give us the tools and we'll finish the job, that we have to do that. So the answer to your question is, we can tell beforehand if they're unified, if they have that unity of spirit. We can tell by the way they're fighting. And I'm not just talking about, you can have spirit and send successive waves of people in a futile effort to attack something. But if you are willing to learn, if there's trust in the unit, that glue that holds it together, a good leader in the Pentagon knows that, can tell that, and we know that we're halfway there with respect to giving them the capabilities that they need to resist Russian aggression.
The war seems to be in a bit of a stalemate, but do you think that the Russians are eventually going to win or lose?
My question for Putin would be, once you've completely destroyed Mariupol and you've completely destroyed the infrastructure in the Donbass region, for example, what in the world are you going to do with this region that has no infrastructure and a hostile population? I mean, do we characterize that as winning? Really? What have you won in the 21st century? Somebody's going to have to rebuild that infrastructure, and resources are going to have to be expended to suppress a hostile population. And it's going to be a drain for years and years to come. So even if they are successful in seizing this territory, they're going to have to deal with this hostility and this economic drain for years and years to come.
Regardless of the esprit de corps, the morale of the Ukrainians, which has been tremendous, impressive example of character, the Russians at the end of the day have a much more advanced force, including especially an air force. Yet
Some
it
U.S.
seems like
officials
the
are actually
Russians might be
reportedly
holding back a
surprised by the
little bit.
risk-averse approach that Russia has taken with its vast air power against Ukraine's much smaller air force.
And I know the Ukrainians
As
have
one
good
retired
anti-air weaponry from the West, but can't the Russians just achieve air superiority over Ukraine if they want it?
Well, to your point, um, they certainly would seem to have the numbers and the quantity to achieve air superiority. We keep saying they're holding back. So my response to that would be, why would they hold off on something as fundamental to their success as air superiority? I don't necessarily think that they're holding back on air superiority. Air superiority at this point would require them to suppress the enemy at SEAD, suppress the enemy air defense systems, which have proven to be extraordinarily effective by using, a combination of the Ukrainians using a combination of Russian S-300 systems as well as the Stinger missiles that we're sending them. I think what we're discovering is, and this is probably, we can discuss this a little bit more about some of the innovations that have been revealed during this conflict, is it is far easier to deny someone air superiority than to achieve air superiority. And that's what we've discovered, the Ukrainians have discovered. So if they are holding back on achieving air superiority, for the life of me, I can't understand why.
I want to talk a little bit about something that we've all seen if we've been following the war, which is tons and tons of tanks and armored vehicles in the Russian military, totally shredded, destroyed by the side of the road. There's been lots of reports of the success Ukrainian forces have had attacking Russian tanks.
Outgunned and outmanned Ukrainians stopping a Russian armored column in its tracks.
Tanks have
US
basically since World War II have been a feature of most modern militaries, something that's been a powerful battlefield system. And all of a sudden, it seems like that might be shifting thanks to the javelins and the British variant, the NLAW, that's been so successfully deployed. Are the days of the tank over?
Well, I'm always I'm always reluctant to make declarative statements like the age of the tank over. I remember 1990. I remember running with a young newly commissioned officer, and this was after, after Panama, and I remember this young man saying that, from his perspective, armored warfare. This is 1990 now. Armored warfare was over, and we just fight colonial wars from now until the Cold War spell the end of armored warfare, and we'd just be fighting colonial wars like Panama for the next 50 years. And I remember running very. I didn't say a word because I'm a historian by nature, and I know that history is cyclical. So the answer to your question is, I don't know if the tanks are dead. I would tell you that employing tanks without adequate combined arms coordination, that's dead. So sending unprotected columns of tanks forward, not with integrated infantry to clean out the enemy's infantry that might possibly be using anti-tank weapons, without artillery to suppress the infantry that might be using anti-tank weapons, without ground-based radars to determine where these might be, and a number of other, and without air superiority. So I would say using tanks as a sledgehammer without appropriate combined arms accompaniments and multipliers, excuse me, that's certainly dead. And I would say that tanks are I mean, obviously the vulnerability of tanks has been displayed here. And certainly the way the Russians have used the tanks, that way is dead. Yes.
Well, and you're pointing out the logistical failures of the Russian military, which is kind of shocking. I want to dig into that a little bit because another thing that I've read is that the success of training the Ukrainian military in what is a sort of a NATO-style decentralized command and control structure. So for the non-security nerds listening in, that means basically non-commissioned officers on the battlefield are empowered to make decisions. They're given an objective, but have wide latitude to figure out how to complete that objective. Russian units are trained in an opposite way, which is basically a very centralized command and control structure where a general or somebody maybe not even on the battlefield is saying, march from point A to point B. When you get there, we'll tell you what to do next. That Russian method has been exposed here as being very ineffective in this setting. So I'm curious if you think that style of command and control that's exhibited by the Russians is really the cause of so many of their failures on the battlefield.
I think it's a cause of a great deal of their failures on the battlefield. Look, the entire United States military culture is predicated on the underlying cultural principle of unpredictability. We have two jokes that we learn almost from the very beginning of our careers. The old joke that the Russians and the Soviets used to say, Americans have very specific doctrine, they just don't read it. And so they're making things up as they go along. And what that displays really in reality is our tolerance for innovation, our tolerance for um, uh, pushing leadership and pushing decisions down to the very lowest level. I remember explaining to a Chinese general once how we did battle command orders, and how we pushed it down to the lowest sergeants. And if the colonel got killed, the lieutenant colonel would take over. And if all the officers were killed, the senior NCOs would take over and they'd accomplish the mission. And I remember these Chinese generals could not get their mind around that. They just couldn't. That a junior person would have sufficient situational awareness and feel empowered to do that. The second joke that we always talk about is, and you've heard this a million times, but it really is revealing about why the Russians are failing and why we succeed. It's easy. How many times have you heard it's easier to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission? You say it all the time. That philosophy, that culture, and it sometimes it goes unstated, is taught from the very beginning of an American soldier's military education. Where in the case of the Russians, by the time those soldiers got to that point they were told to march to, the entire situation on the ground might have changed. An American soldier would have looked at it and said, yeah, I know what the colonel said, but this is what it looks like now, and this is what we're going to do. And then he'd call back, and rather than feeling threatened by that in a U.S. leadership scenario, the U.S. commander is going to say, okay, let me know how it goes,
When we come back, I'll ask Hoop about the lessons drawn from the war in Ukraine and what that means for the U.S.-China security competition. Hey, World Unpacked listeners. I hope you're enjoying the episode. For more great episodes of The World Unpacked, make sure to hit that subscribe button on your preferred podcast platform. And tell all your colleagues at the State Department, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or just the next folks you have over for dinner that they should subscribe to. Thanks for listening. I want to pick up right where we left off. We were talking about how the Russian command and control structure is very centralized and how that inhibits their performance in the battlefield, at least in Ukraine. The Chinese military has the same style of command and control. Does this mean that their military isn't going to be as effective as we might think it is?
I believe it does. And I believe this for a number of reasons. Number one, certainly, and I want to start off by saying, please don't misunderstand. The Chinese military has made enormous strides in improving the technological quality of their force, and they have a large quantity of equipment, increasingly modernized equipment, to put forth on the battlefield. But never forget, the Chinese soldier has not fought active combat, with the exception, obviously, of the border incursions on the Indian border, which are fairly static in nature. The average Chinese soldier and the average Chinese military leader has not fought a conflict since the war with Vietnam in 1979. That was a long time ago. I would say that, and never forget as well, the Chinese military is a party military. It is not a national military. It is subordinate to the Communist Party of China. And it still has, the Chinese military still has a dual system, which consists of a commander and a political commissar, who are in theory both co-equals, although there have been an increasing evolution in Chinese forces to tip the balance of power towards the operational commander, but the political commissar is still there to determine whether or not the actions are consistent with party goals, not operational goals.
I know that it's been a priority of Xi Jinping to modernize the Chinese military, from nuclear weapons down to conventional forces, Navy. They're obviously building islands in the South China Sea so they can project power. Xi Jinping and Putin have long been friends, and clearly the Chinese are sort of blessed the Russian incursion into Ukraine, and at least are not standing up to try to stop it. But Xi Jinping's probably looking at this and thinking, wow, this isn't going so great for Putin. And I'm wondering what lessons you think Xi is drawing from this war for his own military.
First of all, they are they are very, very keenly studying the power and the duration of economic sanctions and the ramifications for Russia. Okay, they're studying that very carefully. Now, the Chinese economy is far more diverse than the Russian economy, and the relative simplicity, energy-based simplicity of the Russian economy has made it a little bit easier for us to isolate the Russian economy, very similar to what we did during the containment era of the Cold War, which is cut them off and isolate them. But they're watching that very closely. They are studying the fact that projecting power in an invasion to invade another country is far more problematic and difficult than it appears on paper. And remember, the Russian invasion is taking place over a relatively flat area, a flat plain. In fact, it's so flat, it's the source of 29% of all the wheat on the planet, right? So, and with a contiguous border, the Chinese would have to project power across the Taiwan Straits. They'd have to establish lodgements on Taiwan, and then Taiwan's topography, whereas the Ukrainian-Russian topography is fairly level. The topography of Taiwan is really mountainous. I don't know if you've ever been there, but Taiwan has a coastal plain in the east and west, and the entire center of the country is mountainous. And so they're studying very carefully what a determined populace can do in resisting an invasion, if the invasion is not sufficiently supplied, which brings me to my third point, this issue of logistics. Okay. The Russians had a difficulty establishing supply chains on land, coming directly out of Russia and not more than 300 or 400 miles. Imagine trying to sustain logistics support for an invasion of an island when the entire surrounding area of the island is hostile territory. Unless, of course, and it places an additional emphasis on air superiority and some other things. The Chinese are looking at the importance of information-based warfare. I think we would all agree that Ukrainians and Zelensky won the information war, the global information war. They won it out of hand, and the Russians will never recover from it. And the Taiwans are studying that very carefully. So the Chinese are studying how they might win the information war, or at the very least, deny the Taiwans a victory in the information war. They're looking at the implications of a short versus a long conflict. Okay, as we said in the very beginning, the Russians anticipated a short conflict. That did not take place, and the longer this conflict goes on, the more detrimental it is for Russia. And finally, I wanted to go back to something you said about winning and losing, and it's interesting in this political economic context.
So last week, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea fleet sank. And this was the same ship that played a key role in the infamous battle for Snake Island, which I'm sure will be a major motion picture in relatively short order. There's conflicting reports about whether it was struck by a Ukrainian missile or just an accidental fire, but I want to bring this to the US military. We spend billions of dollars on really expensive pieces of equipment. The USS Gerald Ford, for example, which is an aircraft carrier, costs something like $13 billion. Are you concerned that the US military is overinvested in what I understand they call exquisite or like very expensive, large battlefield systems that can be sunk or destroyed relatively quickly in a conventional war?
The short answer to your question is no, I'm not, and I'll tell you why. We tend to focus on, and I say this with all respect, the nature of your question, which is how people normally refer to aircraft carriers. They refer to aircraft carriers in the singular. We don't just deploy aircraft carriers; we deploy aircraft carrier battle groups, and the purpose of that, the sole purpose of all of those ships, the cruisers, the destroyers, the frigates, the littoral combat ships, the submarines. The sole purpose of that battle group is to protect that aircraft carrier. Now, we are in the business. We live on an island, okay, protected in the east by the Atlantic Ocean and the west by the Pacific Ocean. And as a result, the American way of war, certainly since World War I, has consisted of projecting our power across the Atlantic and across the Pacific. There are no better platforms to do that than the aircraft carrier, which balances. I won't say it reduces our dependence on allies and partners, but it certainly provides a balance and a broad spectrum of capabilities that does not necessarily depend upon access and overflight of allies and partners. So what should we learn from this? Certainly, and I won't look. Are our aircraft carriers vulnerable? They absolutely are. Have the Chinese spent an enormous amount of resources determining how they can kill aircraft carriers with weapons such as the hypersonic DF-17 and other things? Absolutely, they have. But that doesn't necessarily. This goes back to what we said earlier about our tanks dead. I'm always reluctant to spell to issue the post-mortem and the obituary on a capability. What this has taught us is that these assets are extraordinarily vulnerable, and that we must exercise all possible prudence in ensuring that we protect them as best we can. But no, I don't think aircraft carriers are dead. I don't think that the principle of projecting our power in that manner is dead. Not yet, anyway.
At the beginning of the Biden administration, there was a lot of overflights by the Chinese military of Taiwanese airspace, a lot of sort of threatening actions taken by the Chinese military around Taiwan. And I know there were a lot of war games that were done in the Pentagon and other parts of the US government about what would happen if the Chinese did invade Taiwan. And I think in most, if not all of those, we sort of lost, meaning the Chinese were successful or successful enough where they achieved most of their military objectives. Do you think the assumptions that underpinned those war games have been threatened or changed as a result of what's going on in Ukraine?
I certainly hope so. I mean, absolutely, I hope so. I hope that we are incorporating the lessons that we are learning in the current conflict in Ukraine into our war games, and that we must always challenge our underlying assumptions about the nature and the character of warfare, particularly in a China-Taiwan scenario. So the answer to your question is yes. I absolutely hope that we are challenging those scenarios. In terms of winning and losing, again, there's so many lessons that we've learned about this that I think we should incorporate into how we approach war games and tabletop exercises with respect to a potential U.S.-China conflict. A short war versus a long war. I mean, the whole importance of the resistance of the Taiwan people and what that can do to a Chinese timetable, similar to what's happened in Ukraine. The importance of logistics, and which has revealed itself as both a key element, but also a vulnerability in the context of an amphibious, a difficult amphibious operation. Anything along the range of possible military operations by China against Taiwan. And there's a full range of that. We tend to default towards what we would call in the military the worst case scenario, which is an invasion. But as you pointed out earlier, there are a number of more likely scenarios: decapitation strikes, full-scale cyber attacks, blockades, any one of a number of other military options that could be employed here that we would also have to have options to address short of a full-on, full-scale invasion. And I often remind people, Doug, there hasn't been a full-scale, successful amphibious invasion since Incheon in 1950. And that's not a coincidence, okay? It's an extraordinarily difficult operation, even for China. So the answer to your question is yes, I certainly hope we're incorporating these things. Whether or not they will have some impact on our assessment of the probability of success of China or our probability of failure remains to be seen.
General Hoop, thank you so much for coming on the show and explaining the future of warfare, Ukraine, Russia, China, and all things security.
Hey, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for asking me, and I wish everybody out there the best of luck.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The World Unpacked, a podcast produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you like the show, please rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero, and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. See you next time.